Hello everyone, this is Professor Patterns. In this video, we're going to be doing a mock interview for a data engineering position. Now, this is completely unscripted, and I want you to pay close attention to how the candidate is going to be responding to questions. Maybe you can also evaluate their answers, and when I ask the questions, you can pause to see if you can answer those questions by yourself. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining me in the session here today. I'm really excited to do this interview. I'd love to hear a little bit more about you, your background and experience, and what kind of got you interested in, this sort of role.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So my name's Kate. I'm a computer science student. I've always been really interested in science, numbers, data specifically. I started university and started with computer science, and I found a passion for data in a project I had, which was based on analyzing different strands of DNA in COVID times. And from there, I started going into data analytics. I took an MIT course based on data science and AI. And I started my first internship a semester ago, and I worked as a data analyst. But since the data I had there was pretty much scattered everywhere, I started also joining the data and exporting it into a database. So I started getting into the field of data engineering and moving the data around. And I found that that's what I'm most interested in.
Nice. So I see that you have quite a varied experience. I would say from data science, data analyst, as well as data engineering.
Yes, I've been really interested in everything that has to do with data. But when I discovered how important it is that the data is actually clean and it's usable, you can't really get good insights if you don't have good data. I, well, due to finding that importance, I found a lot of fulfillment when doing data engineering.
That's great. So could you tell me a little bit more about the kind of projects that you worked on as a data engineer? So you mentioned that you were working a little bit with cleaning. So are we talking about like ETL or what sort of database was it and how many records are we talking about?
So one of the projects, which was the biggest project I did, was in a Snowflake database. I had some data in Excel sheets, some in TXT files, and I also pulled data from an API from a pretty old software. It's pretty interesting getting the data from there. For the files, I did some ETL. I started with cleaning the files with Python and then creating some file formats in the Snowflake database, which was really helpful. I put them in staging tables and exported the data from there into a relational model I'd made in the database. And for the API, I started just querying the data with Postman, trying to get to know the data. And after I had an idea of how it was structured and how the tables were made, I also made a database for that and started pulling the data. I started trying to pull it with Python, but because of the firewall rules of where I was working, it was very difficult to access the API. I would have the IT people in my desk all day trying to surpass firewall rules. And at the end of the day, after joining all the communities, the Snowflake community, the community from the software, all the data engineering communities available, I realized that if I called the API inside Snowflake, the firewall rules wouldn't be able to block me from doing so because it was in the cloud. So I ended up getting the data in SQL with some built-in functions in Snowflake.
Nice. Looks like it was quite an expansive project with a lot of different moving components. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? The just to get an idea about the size of the data that we were talking about, with when you were pulling the SQL scripts or Python scripts.
Course. So for each endpoint, it would vary. In total, I think it was about 6 million registries. Like, I forgot the name for well, 6
Six
million.
million
Yeah, 6 million. And
records. Yeah.
yeah, 6 million records, exactly. I would, for the specific endpoints, when they were too big, the data wouldn't come in because it surpassed the Snowflake limit of megabytes and of records per pull from the API. So I would have to use recursive SQL functions to access it. And I would, at the end, I just created, you have notebooks in SQL, which can be automated to run like each day or every couple hours. So I just did a notebook for each of the endpoints and I would have it run periodically and that would have the recursive functions. So in total, for the data, it was about 6 million records each time all the notebooks are run.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So every interval that you would define based on maybe some sort of cron job, it would be I'm gonna run this notebook maybe once in the morning, once in the evening, and every time it does that, it essentially pulls in 6 million records, and then you apply the cleaning process through a Python script. Is that right? Or a
So
notebook?
the Python script was initially for the other files, like the TXT files, the CSV files. For here, the cleaning was mostly done inside the notebook. Yes, I would use a JSON parser and a little bit of inside the notebook, you can have fight both Python and SQL. So I used a little bit of both.
Gotcha. And within the notebook, is it SQL code or is it Python code or how does that work?
So mostly SQL code. There is one SQL user-defined function that has Python inside it. And that Python script helps to clean the data. But it was mostly Snowflake SQL functions that were the ones that were parsing the JSONs and looking for the file delimiters as well.
Wow. All right. That's a really nice and big, intricate project that you worked on. I'm glad that you had that experience.
It was really, really exciting and completely the project that made me fall in love with data engineering.
That's super cool. Did you have any prior experience with data engineering on any other projects before this one?
I did a project with a Bureau of Lawyers. So it was a nonprofit and they needed an app. And we made an app for them with like a calendar. And I worked as an iOS developer in that project, but also was in charge of all of the database components. And in essence, the app was just for them to be, so if you were a client, you could get to know them a little bit, make an appointment, learn about each lawyer, what they do, etc. They had all their info in Excels and Google Docs. So I was in charge of just moving that around and we made a MongoDB non-relational database for the info so it would be easy to access. The read times were pretty fast and that connected to the app. So my experience was mostly just connecting the database to the application and making the CSV files compatible with the MongoDB database. But it was very few data, so I almost ended up doing it manually because very few Python scripts, nothing of that size of the SQL project size.
All right, so I see that you have a lot of experience with, creating MongoDB database with unstructured data, and I see that you also have some Snowflake experience. Could you just tell me at a high level, why would I ever want to use Snowflake over something like MongoDB? Like, what's the purpose?
So Snowflake is cloud-based and it just charges you based on what you use. So that's really useful for businesses. It's really optimized for analytics. It has a lot of built-in services. It has a thing that makes it really easy to make some front end for your database so anyone can alter it. It has a really good connection with most applications and a really strong AI assistant as well, like a copilot, for example. It can also store any type of data, like semi-structured. You can put JSONs, files, videos, anything you want. And it's really useful also for relational databases. If you want multiple schemas and you want some data to be relational and other to be non-relational, Snowflake really does almost anything you want it to. And MongoDB is a little bit, well, you can scale it horizontally. It's mostly comprised of non-structured data like JSONs. and it's really fast in reads and writes. I think that
Gotcha.
would, yeah, yeah.
Nice. And was it difficult learning Snowflake or coming in from like this experience with SQL, or was it too much of a learning barrier? How was that like?
Well, I had, I forgot to mention this. I had taken a SQL class in school once. I took it like a year before I did my internship. And the second I started the internship, I decided to take all the Snowflake university courses. They're free, so anyone can access them as long as you have, well, obviously, I think you do have to have a Snowflake account, but I just watched all the videos, did all the five, like 8 hour or 6 hour, I don't remember how long they were courses. And that made me feel very well prepared. And also being in the Snowflake community and being able to look everything up was really helpful. It was a little difficult at first to grasp the idea of a non-relational database, especially in the way the data would be structured, because, well, you don't really need a structure and you're always learning about normalizing databases in the more efficient way. And then I realized that Uber and almost everyone uses the non-relational databases. So I think for me, structured data made a little bit more sense because I had more
Okay.
experience. But yeah, I was allowed to find a lot of resources online.
Nice. That's great. And I see that you also have some experience with cloud. If you don't mind me asking, what was your preferred cloud platform of choice?
Oh, I loved Snowflake. Snowflake was the best for me. I really enjoyed the way it let you know how much storage you were using, how much compute power you were using, what they were charging you. Its easy connection to most other softwares made it the best for me.
Got it. And now imagine that you're using Snowflake and you're using it to pull some data and you realize that, well, this data is missing a lot of information. What would you do? Like, what would your process be like when you see something like that in your data set?
So the data is already in Snowflake, or I'm pulling it into Snowflake.
Well, you calling the data from an API, and then you realize when you're looking at the database, like, wait a second, a lot of this stuff is missing. Um, how would you go about debugging that?
So I would start. If I am pulling the data from the API directly into a Snowflake schema, the problem could be in the way I am inserting it into the schema. So the first thing I would do was to open Postman or any other API querying tool that will just show me the raw data and read it there and see if anything's missing. If I see that the data is complete in Postman, the problem is in my schema. So I would have to reorganize or reshape whatever is receiving that data. And if when I'm querying, the API is returning incomplete data, I would have to check probably the endpoint, see if it's the most recent version of the API. I would check in the community if anyone else has encountered a problem like this, maybe even contact the people who did the API to see if there's any troubles with the API itself.
Nice. I think that's a pretty reasonable strategy that you'd want to implement. Um, what about transformation? Just a high level, could you give me an example of a time when you had to apply some transformation to some data?
Well, mostly I've done transformation for dates
Okay.
because I've received multiple data sources and everyone writes the dates differently. And when I want to join certain things based on the date, I do have to reformat the way it's written. Sometimes it has the month written out. Sometimes I live in Mexico, so sometimes it's day first and then the month, and sometimes it's month first and then the date, or maybe the year only has the last two digits instead of all four. So that would be the time I mostly use transformation for dates.
Got it. Makes sense. And what if you notice that in your data set, somehow you just have a bunch of different duplicate rows? Um, what would you do with that?
If if I know that the duplicate rows, if I'm not missing any data and it's just duplicated rows, I would first try to find the source of why that's happening because if it's receiving data directly from a website or an API or something, there must be something wrong in the code. And I would also, well, once I figure out the reason, I would just clean the data with a SQL query to delete all duplicates.
Got it. That makes sense. Imagine that you have this data kind of stored in maybe something like a SQL database, and you have some data scientists on your team, and they want to work with this data, but for some reason, every time they want to pull this data, they're always complaining that it's taking them a huge amount of time to pull this data. Is there any ideas that you might have for a resolution for them that they can use to get this query done faster?
If they're just querying, they're not pulling all of the data.
Yeah, they're just querying like a subset of the data.
I would start with indexes, probably. Yeah, indexes would be the most efficient way, especially if it's a query that they're running the same query multiple times, just in different names. I would create indexes on the fields that they were using so that it would be easier for them to read. And I would try to understand what they're asking of the database. If they're asking just of the last month, for example, I could create some temporary tables or maybe even split the tables so that they are organized by month and they don't have to analyze the data they're not using with the query.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I've been in multiple instances where people have complained that, oh, this data set's taking a really long time to pull. Well, did you create an index on it?
Yeah, indexes are really helpful.
Could you tell me about a time when you mentioned that, you're working quite a bit with the IT teams and everything. So could you tell me about a time when you were collaborating with, multiple people in a team, and maybe you had some disagreements with some people on the way they handled things or the way that they established their workflows. Um, how did you handle it?
Course. In my work, I did have a bit of contact with teams, but it was mostly just me and my boss and personal team, so I didn't have much of that. But in school, I did have a couple disagreements with the way a team I had managed their workload because they were two of my teammates were leaving everything for the end. And when they did turn their parts in, they were mostly incorrect because they hadn't taken the time to do them correctly. So my solution was to do a team meeting for everyone, make sure that everyone went. The first time I tried, they didn't show up, so I had to try again. And I went over, well, that this class is important to all of us, that the grade is shared. And I try to explain to them, well, how this was affecting all of us. And they were a little, at first, they were a little defensive, but then they kind of understood where me and the other teammate who were doing things in time were coming from. And we were able to do, well, to find a nicer path. We decided that everyone would finish their work a day before it was due. And the day it was due, we would just go over things together to make sure everything was correct. And that was pretty helpful for all of us.
All right, perfect. I think that's a great resolution. Like, I think it's always important to make sure that you meet with different stakeholders and just communicate that information. Um, could you tell me about a time, well, maybe a different time when you received some feedback on a project that you worked on, and maybe the feedback wasn't what you expected, maybe the feedback was a little bit difficult to hear. How did you respond to it, and what sort of changes did you make as a result?
Course. So when I was doing the application for the lawyers, we had multiple meetings with the lawyers and everyone who was involved in the application for them to be approving our changes and making a list of requirements, etc. In the first meeting, one of the lawyers wasn't present. So we did all the requirements for the application. They told us what they needed, and we wrote it down, and we coded that. There was something that, looking back, we shouldn't have listened to them when they told us they didn't want this. They mentioned that they didn't need a functionality to modify an appointment. So when you book with them, if you cancel, you can't change it in the app. You had to send a WhatsApp to them. And they told us that they didn't really need it because when people cancel their appointments, it's normally 5 minutes before. and they just wanted to be sent a text, and that's it. But that wasn't really scalable for the future, and we just wanted to follow their directions, so we did. And when we presented the project, well, not for the final project, but like the first sprint, the lawyer who wasn't present in the beginning asked us, and why did you create a calendar function that doesn't have a modified booking button? I mean, how does that work? When have you ever seen that in another software? And he was completely right. Nobody does that. And we couldn't really say, oh, but they told us that they didn't need it because we're the developers and we kind of should have known that you might want to make it scalable and modifiable. And it wasn't great to hear. And I do remember some of my teammates being a little unhappy because we were told specifically not to implement it. But yeah, so what we learned from that was that, first of all, you can't have the requirement meeting without everyone present. If somebody doesn't come, you rebook it. And always try to keep the basic functionalities included, even though they don't specifically tell you to put them in, because at the end of the day, apps need to be scalable. Everything needs to be scalable. And if you don't put it in today, they're going to need it tomorrow. So that was mostly what we learned.
All right, that's some really valuable advice and some valuable insights. I think that that makes a lot of sense, especially thinking about it from a scalability perspective. We definitely want to make sure that we're considering that when we're building our products. Uh, I think that's pretty much all the questions that I had. So I just want to say thank you so much, Kate, for that wonderful interview. I think that the audience is going to have a lot of great perspectives from your accounts, your stories. And before we wrap up, are there any sort of like final advice or any sort of, I guess, general advice that you'd like to share with our viewers who might be considering a similar path in data engineering?
Of course. My advice would be practice. Practice SQL. I started coding with a lot of help from ChatGPT. And when technical interviews rolled around, I realized that I knew no syntax. And it would have been really useful to just try to like start memorizing from the beginning when you code. Don't just leave the learning of the technical syntax to the end because it is going to be a little difficult. Have a good knowledge of Python dictionaries. They're going to be everywhere in technical interviews and in your work. When you do take interviews with hiring managers or anything behavioral, just try to be honest, stay calm, do practice the questions. You can find most on Glassdoor or online, and do mock interviews. They're going to be your greatest friend and ally because coding while explaining to someone else what you're doing is really different than just coding and trying to do something yourself.
That's great. And do you have any platforms that you like to use for mock interviews, or do you just go to your friends and ask them to like, hey, can you interview me?
So I mostly go to my friends. For practicing the technical side, I really like LeetCode for Python. I specifically look for the questions that have to do with strings, arrays, dictionaries. You're not going to be asked, probably, or in my experience, I haven't been asked anything on dynamic programming or trees or anything. They just want to know that you have like a basic ability to manipulate data in Python, maybe some pandas, learning about pandas data frames, visualization as well. And for SQL, I like Data Lemur. It's it's a website made by the author of Acing the Data Science Interview. It's really
Okay.
good, has a lot of questions.
All right. And last question. Did you have any sort of like bad interview round or something that, or an interview round that you failed and you were like, oh no, that was a terrible interview that I just did? Um, Go ahead.
Yes, and I think this is a pretty shared experience. I mean, all of my friends who I practice mock interviews with, we were all completely uh, we completely failed our first interview. All of us, all of us. When you don't know how it's going to be and the nerves take over and it's your first time, it's a little difficult to concentrate. And I do remember being a little disheartened because of the interview. I was asked mostly things that I could have been able to find on Glassdoor or any other programming um, what's it called?
Like site like Glassdoor or LeetCode or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, if you look for them in Glassdoor and LeetCode, you're gonna find them. But I just look for them in general, like the questions. So I learned what my greatest weakness is, what my greatest strength is, and the basic interview questions for other fields. So you have to keep in mind that computer science has their own questions, and they are going to ask you technical questions, and I was not prepared for that. I remember finishing the interview and almost like apologizing, like, I'm so sorry I made you waste your time with this. Excuse me. And I do have friends who have just said, like, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not going to keep wasting your time. And they just hang up. Don't hang up. Take the interviews, practice. But yeah, don't be disheartened if the first couple ones or the first one aren't the best. You keep getting better. It's something that really increases with practice.
Yeah, and I will say like maybe one of my first interviews, maybe coming out of my undergrad, was a really bad coding interview that I, I think that asked me to do something like dynamic programming sort of interview, and like I didn't even know what leak code was at the time. And it was like I'm staring at the screen and it's like it's okay. It was the interviewer was giving me hints, and I was like, this hint's not gonna be helping me. This I'm gonna need a lot more than just that simple hint. So it's completely okay to fail your first couple of interviews. It's very normal, and you just have to embrace it as just a part of that journey. At some point, you just kind of look back at it and like laugh at all of the things that you did in the past.
Yes, you're completely right. You're completely
Well, thank you so much, Kate, for dedicating your time for this interview. I really appreciate it. It really helps the viewers out. And yeah, I thank you so much. And for those viewers who are just kind of tuning in, I'm going to be doing a lot of these mock interviews with more people from data engineering, from data analysts, as well as data science domains. So we'll get a good holistic experience of like what those interview processes are going to be looking like from all of those different fields and domains. So thank you all for tuning in, and see you all in the next one. Goodbye.